I really believe that in 2022, there literally is almost no excuse for what we're seeing right now. There is no excuse under international law for what Russia has done to Ukraine. I mean,
What is the game plan of the Iranian government?
well, as far as I can tell, the plan is to try to create a balancing act internally. So, as you saw over the last several weeks, an enormous, really heavy weight of repression was leveled against people, protesters. There were massive arrests. I mean, at one point, most of the people being arrested, we were told by human rights organizations, were 16, 15, 16-year-olds. So the youth on the street was quite significant. Then you had sham trials. Then you had at least 4 executions. These were all designed to have a chilling effect and to get the protesters off the street. And to an extent, it appears that they have been successful, because the protests, as they were back in September and for many weeks, have dwindled somewhat, although there's still a lot of resistance to the regime going on in Masa Amini's home region, which is the Kurdish part of Iran, and in other parts. And there's many protests that are happening in different ways, but it's not the same as it was over the last several weeks and months. So I think what the regime is trying to do is, number one, survive, and number two, figure out where to let out some air to try to deflate the anger and the anxiety, and where to keep the lid on. And I think that's what it looks like they're trying to do right now.
Many people listening will recall the incident when you were due to interview the Iranian president, and his people came to you and said, although it wasn't in Iran, that they would prefer it if you wore a headscarf. You said you wouldn't, and the interview didn't happen. Is there any part of you that regrets your decision not to wear the headscarf and just go along with it?
Jane, absolutely not. I mean, it came to me in 15 seconds, actually less. They didn't say it would be nice and they would prefer it. They said, unless you wear the headscarf, the president won't be sitting down with you. And this was just thrown at me at the last minute. We had spent a long time securing this exclusive interview. Obviously, it was going to be super important and a big exclusive, because Masa Amini now had died, had been killed essentially in police custody. So there was something big to ask him and to get him to explain this activity, and to see whether the regime would pull back from this kind of violation of human rights. Anyway, many political and other questions. But I have interviewed almost every single Iranian president, since 1980, since the early 90s. And whenever I do so outside of Iran, I never would, and I've never been asked to wear a scarf. It is not the law of the land outside Iran. It is inside Iran. So when we work inside Iran, you'll see most journalists, well, all Western journalists, wear some kind of head covering. So when they asked me to do that, I said no. And then they said, well, you won't get the interview. So I said, well, sorry, but the answer is still no. I gave them the reasons why we should do the interview and how it was an unprecedented request by them, or demand. And I really was standing up for a journalistic principle. The first was, we belong to an independent news organization, and there are no rules or laws in the United States that would require anybody to have to do what they were asking. And number two, that I wasn't going to be told what to do in the United States, Europe, wherever it might be, by a foreign government. I wasn't going to accept that. And I quickly told my bosses, I said, I'm about to, unfortunately, have this interview pulled, but this is the reason. And they backed me, and there was no question. I was not going to do what they asked me to do.
What would you have asked him if you had been right in front of him, wearing a headscarf or not?
I would have asked him the questions you would have asked him. I would have been very strong and tough on the idea of a young woman who was clearly wearing a headscarf, was clearly wearing an overgarment, and that was taken in, and we know that she was roughed up. There were pictures, and we know the story. And I would have asked him, to explain all that, and to try to get him to pull back from that. And then there were other questions, of course. There was the Iran nuclear deal. There were all sorts of other questions. Now, I know there are many, many people who believe that there is no difference between, any of these Iranian leaders. And in general, on a big sense, there isn't. But under some of the regimes, the leaders who call themselves reformists, the previous one, Rouhani, the two before that, Khatami, the rules on women were much, much, much more relaxed. And under Ahmadinejad, but especially under this guy, Raisi, he used women's rights, a woman's body, let's face it, as a political platform. He decided to run a very tough campaign for president. By the way, was the only candidate, based on what he said was going to be very, very tough rules for women and in general in the social space. So he takes the blame for this. I mean, this is what he said, and I think you could lay what happened, at his feet.
You've interviewed so many people, Christiane, over the years. Who's the one that's got away?
Oh gosh, rather too many who've got away. Vladimir Putin's got away. There are many, many people who I'd like to interview, and maybe not huge, massive names, although Putin is a big, massive name because there's a big, massive story going on right now, and he hasn't given any interviews. So, it would have been lovely to interview Her Majesty the Queen, but that was never going to happen.
Oh, that's a good one. What would your opening question have been?
I don't know. I would have to ask you, Fee.
God, there are so many questions I would have liked to ask the Queen.
Particularly right now.
Yeah, I would have started with one, actually, about her feeling about her family, just about being a mum, about being a grandmother, yes, about that very personal side of her life. And obviously she wouldn't have answered, but I would have given it a good shot, I think, as would you, I suppose.
That would have been the best one to ask. You're absolutely right.
Christiane Amanpour, we know you've got to go, but really, really quickly, what has been, as far as you know so far, the single biggest news story of your life?
It would have to be covering the war in Bosnia, because it was my very first war in where it was war against civilians, and it was the first war that it was absolutely deliberately targeting civilians in order to create a political result, which was to try to cleanse territory and purify territory. That is what the Bosnian Serbs, backed by Slobodan Milosevic, backed by Russia, were doing. And it was a huge, it was a genocide in Europe, and it was the first since the Second World War, and it was my first on-the-ground war, except, the first Gulf War. But it taught me everything I know about my profession and personally as well. I learned so much from there, and I now, covering Ukraine, see the same pattern. One big tough leader thinks that he can invade another country, cleanse an area, claim it for himself, annex it, and in the meantime also commit terrible, terrible war crimes. And so I feel there's a real parallel between what happened in the 90s in Europe to what's happening in the 2020s in Europe. And I would say that was my most important story for that reason. Well, it certainly is one of them. I would say it's obviously leading the news. We're doing it at the top of every hour. And as you know, we're 24/7. So we have a lot of time to be able to devote to these kinds of huge stories. And I will be doing it at the top of my program, too, before going into Ukraine and onward in other subjects. But look, it's really, really tragic. You're right. It's a humanitarian crisis, a disaster, as separate from the war we're seeing in Ukraine, which is in its own way a terrible humanitarian crisis and a great violation of international human rights laws. So all of these issues, all of them have to be covered, all of them have to be dealt with. But clearly the response to something like the earthquake in Turkey and Syria is going to be completely different to the response to defending Ukraine.
Tell me about your viewers, or what you know or think you know of your viewers. Are they people who don't think parochially or try not to? Are they people who think on a global scale?
I think they do. I mean, that has been CNN International's raison d'etre since it started in 1985. Ted Turner who was this and still is the great, really not just the great American entrepreneur, the great American success story, but he is the great ahead of his time, cutting edge visionary. So first he started CNN in 1980, and very shortly thereafter he said, look, we need to broadcast around the world. We want to broadcast around the world, because at that time, even the BBC wasn't broadcasting television around the world. It did have its fantastic world service, but not television. And Ted Turner, and it's a long way around to getting to your answer, but I want to explain. He wanted people around the world, particularly in countries that did not have a free and independent press, to have free and independent journalism. In other words, non-state-run journalism. He wanted to bust that mold for people wherever they could manage at that time to have a satellite downlink, or the initial ways of getting this kind of cable or satellite information. So yes, that has had an amazing effect around the world since we started going international in 1985. And I really do believe that we are the place that most people turn to around the world for these kinds of big breaking news stories. And the facts and the figures and the audience research bears that out. And that's the same in the United States as well.
Does the rest of the world care very much about the UK?
Ooh, now that is a touchy question. Look, we, like many international organizations, have our main international news hub in the UK. The reason is that for decades and decades, the UK has been the most important place to be for, as a headquarters, and to be able to launch from there. So whether it's sending out reporters, crews, and the rest, the UK Bureau for CNN and all the other international news organizations has been the main international outlet for us. Look, the United Kingdom, as you know, punched above its weight for decades and decades and decades after the fall of empire. It nonetheless had a massive role to play in the West, in the world, especially as its crucial bridge in the transatlantic alliance. And also, as we can see now in Ukraine, it does have a very important military defense role around the world as well. So I think people do care, but I think people are wondering, particularly in Europe, are wondering about Britain's place in the world now in a post-Brexit world.
Yeah, I mean, isn't the truth that actually Boris Johnson was, relatively speaking, a kind of international box office figure, and Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, perhaps rather less so? So at the moment, we're not only not punching above our weight, we're not really punching at all.
Well, again, we internationally don't have the same kind of ratings as we do in the United States to measure second by second, minute by minute, which prime minister, which leader generates the most eyeballs, so to speak. Clearly, Boris Johnson, because he was described as the British Trump. And so people were able to put him in that box. And during the time between Brexit and 2020, so between Brexit and then the Trump election several months later, the global, certainly the Western wave of populist nationalism that hit the world for a couple of years, yes, somebody like Boris Johnson was a curiosity object, and people would watch. And then, of course, it goes back to when he was mayor and all those, fun things he did, like get caught on some kind of, ropes and this and that. I mean, he's a humorous figure, and people think that he makes them laugh. So yes, in that regard, he did, secure quite a lot of eyeballs. Now it's different because, as I say, Britain has a different place in the world, particularly with the United States. The US is still quite, well, how can I put this diplomatically, cross that the British government may end up not honoring the Northern Ireland Protocol, and thus punching a hole in a key American success story, because along with the United States and Britain, the Good Friday Peace Accord, along with the Northern Ireland players, is something to be treasured. And certainly the US does not want to risk that, and says over and over and over again, whether it's Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, whoever might be the leader, that there will be no special relationship that includes a special trade deal and the like, and if the Northern Ireland peace agreement is at risk. And in April it's the 25th anniversary, and it's a big deal for the US, of course.
Can I ask you about your sense of outrage, Christiane, as you go through a very long and distinguished journalistic career? Does it diminish as you accept that we appear to be a species of repeat offenders, really? Or does it increase with the frustration that perhaps we are? Do you find that you get more cynical or less cynical?
Hi, Fee. It's good to see you as well.
Yes, very nice to see you too.
I've never been cynical, Fee. I hate to say that, but if I was a cynic, I don't think I could do my job in the way that I feel I need to do my job, which is to go out and tell the stories and be the eyes and ears of people who can't actually travel or don't want to travel, obviously, to some of these, let's face it, God-forsaken parts of the world that need their stories told, that need the human story, told, whether it's women in Afghanistan or Iran, whether it's civilians in Ukraine who are being pounded by an illegal invasion by a much, much bigger neighbor, Russia, all of those stories, whether it's the climate, whatever it might be. I cannot afford, nor is it in my character, to be a cynic, because if I was, I think I might have given up a long time ago, because you rightly say that I actually have witnessed, along with many of my colleagues from around the world, some of the most inhuman and inhumane actions that people can do to each other. And that does actually still, I have to say, surprise me. There's this question that often gets posed at the back of magazines. Are you surprised by how much harm, evil, poverty, abuse there is in the world? Or are you surprised that you think it shouldn't exist? I really believe that in 2022, there literally is almost no excuse for what we're seeing right now. There is no excuse under international law for what Russia has done to Ukraine. I mean, none. There's no excuse under international law or our presumably, hopefully, developed civilization for the way women are treated, not just in Afghanistan and Iran and elsewhere, but even here in the UK. The rapes, the domestic abuse, the mental health crises, all of that kind of thing.
But can I ask you this, Christiane? So do you not think, though, that we do our viewers and listeners and readers a disservice by not sharing some sense of that outrage at the moment?
Well, who doesn't share it? I mean, I share it. When I report the facts, and I report with the due feelings and passion that any story deserves. And I think we share it. You're doing it, presumably, on your wonderful new show. You did it in your previous one. Other journalists are doing it. I think we're showing the passion.